this video, we're unpacking the intense controversy surrounding President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's recent declaration of a state of emergency in Rivers State. We'll analyze the removal of elected officials, the suspension of democratic structures, and what these unprecedented moves mean for Nigeria's constitutional integrity. Could the president's actions set a dangerous new precedent? Were constitutional lines crossed? And why should every Nigerian be concerned? We'll also discuss the deeper implications for governance, rule of law, and what we as citizens can and should do about it. This video isn't about information, it is about action. It is about explaining to you what you need to do and why you need to do it. Stay with us for the full details. Welcome back. If you are new here, please subscribe and follow us on all NEAT social media platforms at neatcommunity.ng. Also, it will be nice if you can turn on the notification icon so you can get notified each time we upload new content. There are a number of topics we need to cover, so rest assured we will be uploading new content every week. NEAT is an acronym for Nigerians Engineering Astounding Tomorrow. It is an initiative designed to bring together young and intelligent Nigerians who have what it takes to look beyond the challenges and divisions in the country and formulate a plan that would transform the nation and follow through with the plan. Right, we're analyzing the ongoing tension in Nigeria. It's about the declaration of a state of emergency in Rivers State and the removal of the supposedly elected governor of a state. Now let's start the conversation with the events of March 18th, 2025. On this day, Nigerian President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, in a national broadcast, declared a state of emergency in Rivers State. He said it was because the governor, Siminalayi Fubara, ignored a court order, couldn't fix the issues between himself and the State House of Assembly. The president also suggested that, either directly or indirectly, Fubara's actions might be responsible for some recent damage to an oil pipeline. Along with this state of emergency, the president announced the suspension of Fubara, his deputy, Ngozi Odu, and the entire House of Assembly for at least 6 months. As part of his speech, he blamed the governor for failing to ask for support in addressing whatever the issue was. Before all this, it had been widely reported that the State Assembly had started the process to impeach the governor. Many believed the impeachment push was actually engineered by lawmakers who weren't loyal to the governor but had other interests, ones that weren't in the best interest of the people of the state. It's rumored that it all began after what many called a chaotic election in 2023 that brought the governor into office. They say Nyesom Wike, the former governor and current minister of the FCT, demanded control of the state's infrastructure and resources as a reward for helping Fubara get into power. In an effort to protect the state's interests, Fubara declined this request, and that's when things went downhill. Now, whether these rumors are true, exaggerated, or completely fabricated, that's up for interpretation. But that's not the focus here. What really matters is what this situation means for the integrity and progress of the country. To really get into this, we need to break down the president's declarations, what they mean for the nation, and whether intervention was necessary. The general feeling is that this issue is already settled, but is that really the case? Could there be a twist in the story that might shock the president, the governor, and everyone else involved? That's exactly what we want to explore in this video. But first, let's start with the most obvious points. As someone who took an oath to protect the nation's constitution, should the president have declared a state of emergency? Is this fulfilling his responsibility, or did he abuse the very oath he swore to uphold? When we look at the Constitution, there's really not much to support declaring a state of emergency, especially when we consider the public information that's available. According to the Constitution, a state of emergency is meant to restore or maintain the integrity of the Nigerian state, especially when any part of the country is under threat. Basically, it's a response to major threats to national sovereignty and law and order. Another valid reason for declaring a state of emergency would be if there's a breakdown of law and order between communities. But it's not really intended for situations where there's internal conflict within a state's governing structure. Those issues should be handled by the state's judicial system. And it certainly isn't for cases where a single facility is damaged by alleged actions of citizens protesting. So when the president declared a state of emergency, none of the default scenarios for declaring a state of emergency were actually happening. Now, the Constitution does have a provision for declaring a state of emergency if there's an imminent threat to law and order, especially due to ethnic divisions. So, was there enough ethnic tension at the time to be considered a real threat to law and order? To some extent, yes, but the president's reasons didn't really focus on this. So, should we just ignore his reasons and focus on what was actually happening at the time? I guess so. The situation wasn't just about the governor and the State House of Assembly, or even the governor and the minister of the FCT. There were signs that things were escalating into inter-ethnic tensions. Many people, especially after hearing some of the governor's comments in a session with Ijaw youths, started to feel like the situation was heading in that direction. Some people, however, see things differently. They argue that the tension at the time wasn't as high as it had been in the past. They point to events of 2024, when the governor was accused of demolishing the State House of Assembly, claiming it was for renovations, a move that is generally seen as politically motivated to stop assembly members who weren't loyal to him from starting an impeachment process. He is also believed to have presented a budget to just 4 of his loyal assembly members to rebuild the government house. These people feel that the period leading up to the declaration of the state of emergency was actually less tense. They argue that by the time the state of emergency was declared, things had started to calm down. They also point out that even though disloyal assembly members locked the gates to prevent the governor from entering a session, he kept his cool and didn't escalate the situation. And they believe the president's claim that the governor didn't obey a court order was baseless, especially since the governor had already accepted the judicial ruling to annul the local government elections he had ordered. Clearly, there are different perspectives on this, but we're sticking to the view that based on all the information available in the public domain, the situation could have been seen as an imminent threat to law and order. The main reason for this is that there were hardly any constitutional grounds for managing the situation. For instance, this was a matter that involved all 3 arms of government. The idea that the judiciary was acting as an independent body here is questionable. Many in the public, especially from an ethnic perspective, saw the judiciary as being divided along certain interest lines. Given all this, it's understandable why a state of emergency might have been declared in this context. Without declaring a state of emergency, there was no official way for the executive or even the federal legislature to step in. Sure, the president could have tried being more diplomatic by calling the parties for a meeting, but that would still have been unconstitutional. Any suggestions or recommendations made in that context might not have been seen as binding and could easily be interpreted as biased, especially considering the existing conflicts of interest. Especially with the FCT minister being a known ally of the president, his options were pretty limited. At this point, the only reasonable way for the president to have stepped in was through the official channel of declaring a state of emergency. But here's the question. Just because the president had the option to declare a state of emergency, does that mean he should ignore the oath he swore to protect the Constitution? That's what we need to address here. In his speech, the president announced the suspension of the governor, the deputy governor, and the entire House of Assembly. He also appointed a retired Navy officer as the sole administrator for the state. The president went on to say that the administrator wouldn't make laws but would formulate regulations with the approval of the Federal Executive Council. But were there any constitutional provisions for any of these actions? Honestly, there wasn't any constitutional backing for these actions. But to be fair, there weren't any constitutional provisions to resolve this situation once it was seen as an imminent threat to law and order. So, what were the president's options? A better approach could have been to set up a committee made up of key stakeholders, maybe traditional leaders from around the state or even across the country, to mediate between the governor and the House of Assembly and help move things forward. Instead, the president chose to create more constitutional confusion. He suspended a democratic system, removed elected officials from a sovereign state, delegated army personnel against peaceful communities, gave lawmaking power to the Federal Executive Council, and appointed a former military officer to run things, bypassing the political structures in place. You could list so many constitutional breaches here. And let's not forget that the sole administrator was told to ignore the main issue behind the state of emergency and focus on financial expenditures instead. While the Constitution doesn't say anything about appointing a sole administrator, it does clearly state that if the state assembly is unable to legislate, the responsibility falls to the National Assembly, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate. So, in trying to deal with what was seen as a threat to law and order, the president ended up creating an even bigger problem through confusion. In his broadcast, he claimed that a gazette had been sent to both assemblies for review and approval, as the Constitution requires. The president's announcement, followed by a media clarification session from the Attorney General, really brought this issue to the public's attention. Opposition parties quickly took to social media, condemning the actions, but most of them focused primarily on the removal of the governor, deputy, and the House of Assembly, while largely ignoring all the other complicated constitutional issues created by the Tinubu administration. Before the National Assembly even had a chance to review the matter, news broke that the president had already sworn in the sole administrator on his own. Then came reports that funds, which had been withheld from the democratic system because of the tension, would now be released to this undemocratic system, while the tension still hadn't been resolved. This is yet another clear threat to law and order. But honestly, these aren't just threats to law and order, they're a complete breakdown of it. The public was outraged again, blasting it as another example of political manipulation, with many accusing the administration of trying to capture financial resources for the 2027 elections. People across the country felt like the situation was hopeless, while others still held out hope that the National Assembly wouldn't ratify the declaration. But then news broke that the House of Representatives had already ratified the proclamation, with no details on the other contradictions we've discussed. A video that circulated online suggested that the House decided on the matter via voice voting. A lot of people argued that this decision should have been made through a count to ensure it had the approval of 2/3 of the members, as required by the Constitution. But here's the question. Is 2/3 actually required when it comes to a presidential declaration of a state of emergency? We'll get into that shortly, but let's first look at it from the Senate's perspective. A few hours after the public had processed the news from the House of Representatives, the Senate came out with its own statement. They said that after a closed session briefing, they had agreed to ratify the proclamation of the state of emergency, along with most of the other constitutional breaches. They simplified the whole situation, reducing the long list of constitutional violations to just a simple matter of approving the state of emergency. However, they did make a recommendation. They suggested that the president form a committee of prominent Nigerians, whatever that means, to help settle the issues between the two parties. They also added that the sole administrator's legislative duties should be overseen by both houses of the National Assembly, not just the Federal Executive Council. Now let's get to the heart of this video. What's really going on here, and what should we do about it? You might remember from one of our earlier videos where we said the core issue in Nigeria comes down to colonization, and the Constitution is what continues to sustain that colonization. What's happening here is a clear case of people exploiting gaps in the Constitution. The real flaw is that the Constitution doesn't provide a way to handle attempts at state capture. But that's not the only problem. Another big issue is the failure of elected officials to act responsibly. And when there's no system in place to hold them accountable, can we really blame them for taking advantage of the situation? The president, in this case, should not have suspended the supposedly elected officials. Yes, he could have declared a state of emergency, but the best move would have been to bring in different stakeholders from the state to mediate between the conflicting parties, giving them a set time, maybe a week or two, to resolve things. All the other constitutional breaches were unnecessary and showed a lack of commitment to the Constitution he swore to protect. Now, let's talk about the Senate. The Senate's own rules say that when dealing with a declaration of emergency, they need to go into a closed session. But here's the thing. Senate rules are secondary to the Constitution. The Constitution itself requires that matters related to constitutional amendments or breaches be handled in open session, and it specifically demands a 2/3 majority approval from the members. While it's understandable that Senate rules might require them to go into a closed session for matters like a state of emergency, the bigger issue here is the substance of the matter. We're talking about constitutional breaches, basically setting a new law through precedent. So no matter what was discussed in that closed session, the Senate should have been sharp enough to separate the issues. Sensitive matters could have been dealt with privately, but the big issues, like the suspension of the governor, the deputy, and the House of Assembly, should have been discussed openly. They should have known that these are matters of constitutional amendment through precedent. One senator should have stepped up and insisted that matters like the suspension of elected officials be debated in an open session, following the constitutional amendment process. They should have made sure that the matter regarding the appointment and swearing in of the sole administrator was also handled in the open session, because they all relate to constitutional amendment. Plus, the voting on all of this should have required a 2/3 majority from both houses of the National Assembly, as well as from the 36 states, just like the Constitution demands. It's possible that the senators didn't follow the proper process, but not necessarily because they were all bribed. It could be more about a lack of clarity. As argued in Beyond the Past, this issue of lack of clarity, which unfortunately is a result of colonization, often leads Nigerians to focus on what they don't need to know while missing out on the knowledge they really need. Any aspiring senator should have a solid grasp of the laws and how to use them to protect the integrity of the nation. So, now that these procedures weren't followed, what's the next step? A lot of Nigerians have taken a back seat in this situation. Some are blaming the opposition, but they're doing so for the wrong reasons. They think the solution lay in organizing protests, which the opposition, especially the presidential candidates, were supposed to lead. But is that really a solution? You should watch the video that talks about the issues within the Nigerian Constitution to get better information on why this isn't a good idea. Defend the sovereignty of the nation, but not through protests. Instead, by using the law to our advantage. Right now, the best course of action is for a coalition of Nigerians to take this to court, asking the court to reverse the decisions made by both the presidency and the Senate. The argument? That the constitutional provisions weren't followed, and that's something we can't accept. We elected all of them to follow the Constitution, not to violate it. Constitutional amendments have a strict process for a reason. It's designed to make sure there's broad acceptance from the Nigerian people. It can't and shouldn't be done under the guise of a state of emergency. Giving the president the power to remove a democratic structure from any state sets a very dangerous precedent, and that's something we shouldn't accept. Likewise, using Senate rules to bypass constitutional requirements when ratifying constitutional amendments is also a dangerous precedent that could cause serious problems down the line. We're also not supposed to take this. A lawsuit from the people of Nigeria against the executive and the legislative branches shouldn't even be up for debate in court. The Constitution is clear. Sovereignty belongs to the people, so neither the president nor the legislature can go against the will of the people. The actions of both the executive and the National Assembly could easily be considered treason. While we might be able to forgive them for the sake of continuity on the assumption of error, we can't ignore this rare chance to hold the government accountable. All it takes is your signature. This is a rare opportunity to let the entire federal government know that crossing boundaries like this will no longer be tolerated. To support this, visit www.civilrevo.org/neat. Thank you, and see you in the next video.